Remember the left shark from the Super Bowl a few years ago? He was supposed to be just a guy in a shark costume dancing next to Katy Perry during the halftime show, but because he decided to do his own thing, he became the center of attention. Every so often another left shark will come along in the background of an event, only to steal the show. The most recent of these was the Fiji Water girl during the Golden Globes red carpet, who has been given the title of 2019's first meme after appearing to have photobombed many shots of celebrities that night. Her real name is Kelleth Cuthbert, a Canadian model and influencer. That brings us to today's topic. As you'll find out, this everyday object is less about necessity, but more about clever marketing, even before Cuthbert generated $12 million worth of brand exposure this past week. You're listening to The Story Behind, the extraordinary history of the ordinary. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind bottled water. But first, a quick message. Thank you to everyone who has been sending me images of you holding the Story Behind book, including many of you who got it as a gift over the holidays. If you look on my Instagram for the show, Story Behind Pod, you'll see one of the highlights on my profile is called Book Sightings, where I love reposting these photos. And if I've missed adding your photo to the highlight or you'd like to be in it, please tag me over on Instagram and I'll be happy to add your photo to that highlight. I love seeing pictures of you reading the Story Behind book. It absolutely makes my day. So again, thank you from the bottom of my heart for spreading the word about the Story Behind book. And I love that I can say the book has done so well because of my amazing listeners. That's you. Water has been bottled since ancient times, so the practice of finding containers for water is nothing new. Although maybe bottled water is the wrong term for back then, since water was originally contained in ceramic or animal skins. Ancient Romans were known to have an affinity for water sources. Not only were they used for the community bathing and recreation, but springs were especially seen as magical, and the water from them was used for medicinal purposes. But for centuries, the idea of bottling water and selling it would have been laughable. It's said that water was first bottled commercially in the United Kingdom's Holywell bottling plant in 1622. But before that, in the mid-16th century, natural mineral water from Belgium, France, Italy, and Germany was prized. In America, records show that water from Jackson Spa in Boston began being sold as early as 1767. By the 18th century, though, mineral water from natural sources got a resurgence in use for healing. Spa vacations at places featuring springs were trendy for those who could afford it. Bottled water found a surge in popularity in the 1800s once it was discovered that diseases like cholera and typhoid were often transmitted through the public water supply. Here's one of those tangents I tend to take when researching episodes. When I read the part about bottled water finding popularity during cholera and typhoid outbreaks, I remembered learning in middle school about John Snow and how he disproved the theory that cholera was an airborne disease by making a map of the houses affected by it. He realized many of them were located on Broad Street, and many of those also affected either worked on Broad Street or were known to pass through Broad Street to and from work. He was able to deduce from his map that the water pump on Broad Street was contaminated. As soon as the pump handle was removed, the outbreak began to subside. But there was one house on his map he couldn't make sense of. It wasn't near Broad Street, and the woman who died didn't travel through the area. But she did live there months earlier, and as Snow found out from her son, she liked the water from the Broad Street pump so much, she had a cart sent to the pump daily with a bottle to fill up to bring back to her. But once chlorination was introduced to the public water supplies in the early 1900s, waterborne diseases were drastically reduced. But that meant the water from natural springs that didn't need chlorination began to appeal to the more wealthy. They continued vacationing in resorts known for their spas and springs, like Sarasota Springs in New York, so they could bathe and drink the natural mineral water. As glass bottles became easier to make in the 1850s, these spring waters could be bottled and sold in stores. Bottled water was considered a medicinal product. In fact, when Hiram Ricker began drinking from the spring on his family's main resort, he found his stomach ailments began to disappear after only a week. He and his family began bottling and selling the water for 5 cents per gallon throughout New England. By the time bottled water really took off, Poland Spring was already ahead of the game. The bottled water boom in America is said to have really begun in the 80s. Perrier led the way. The French sparkling spring water was originally only sold in a few high-end restaurants, but in 1977, the company hired Bruce Nevins, a former Levi Strauss executive, to help market the brand to Americans. Gustave Levin, who had purchased Perrier in 1947, had seen tremendous popularity in France when he began heavily marketing the natural spring water. Before he hired Nevins for the American office, he was told by several consultants that he wouldn't have much success in the countries where soda and alcohol were the favorite beverages. But after hiring Nevins, an advertising campaign costing between $2.5 million and $5 million was launched and featured the voice of Orson Welles.
Deep below the plains of southern France, in a mysterious process begun millions of years ago, nature herself adds life to the icy waters of a single spring, Perrier. Its natural sparkle is more delicate than any made by man, and therefore more quenching, more refreshing, and the mixer par excellence, naturally sparkling from the center of the earth. Perrier.
The marketing targeted the baby boomers who were entering corporate America and looking for any edge they could get on appearing sophisticated. In a world where older executives were ordering martinis for lunch, the younger generation took on a more conscientious role by ordering Perrier, showing they were going to come right back from their lunch breaks with a clear head and ready to work more. Or at least this was the persona developed by Perrier as their ideal market. And it worked. Those baby boomers were also getting more into fitness, and the running boom that had started in the late 70s continued. Perrier saw this and began sponsoring the New York City Marathon. Their targeted advertising hit at just the right time, and soon Perrier became the go-to for sparkling bottled water. By the 90s, soft drink companies saw the effects bottled water was having on the beverage market. First Perrier, then Poland Spring Water out of Maine, like we talked about. Pepsi first introduced their bottled water, Aquafina. Coca-Cola held out for a few more years, but after seeing Aquafina's success, soon came out with their own brand, Dasani. This also gave consumers a more affordable choice of bottled water. But if you wanted to appear trendy, you went with brands like Perrier or Evian, both from France and both naturally sourced, while the cola companies, as well as Seagram's and Schweppes, were filtering and sometimes carbonating what was essentially tap water. The trend of bottled water increased year after year, and in 2017, the sale of bottled water surpassed the sale of soda for the first time in the United States. No longer is it really a status symbol of wealthy to carry around a bottle of water, but it is shown as a symbol for those concerned about their health and diets. It's said that at least 40% of bottled water starts out as tap water, which includes Dasani and Aquafina. Although don't go running to your tap with some spare bottles to start your own bottled water company just yet. The water is put through filtration, reverse osmosis, and exposed to ultraviolet light in order to make sure the water is safe and palatable. Going back to talking about Fiji, at one point they were under fire because of their carbon footprint. Their water really does come from Fiji, a country in the South Pacific, but it's shipped to America and other countries and transported using oil and trucks. And they also use some of the heftiest plastic bottles compared to other bottled water brands. But it's also the #1 imported water brand in America, even beating out Evian. And this is all despite the fact that it's sometimes 2 to 3 times more expensive than some other brands of bottled water. Fiji has since tried to diminish their carbon footprint, even saying they are now carbon negative and contribute more to the environment than they take from it. They've since reduced their CO2 emissions and source 50% of their energy from renewable sources. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the water has been made using more environmentally friendly measures. It actually means that the company contributes to and invests in energy and conservation projects that they say overcompensate for their carbon emissions by 120%. I should point out that this information was from 2014, so it may have since been updated. But I weirdly couldn't find this claim anymore on their website. Bottled water itself has also come under fire, not just Fiji. I've gotten comments before that this show is a bit American-focused, so I apologize for only having these statistics. About 90% of community water systems in America meet or exceed federal standards for clean, drinkable water. But even though that's a high percentage, the 10% that's left over is still millions without clean tap water. My husband thinks I'm nuts when I drink water straight from the tap, even though we have a separate faucet in our sink that provides filtered water. In my defense, I like my water a little warmer from the cold one on the filtered side, but that's just me. But experts say that even though filters for the tap water may be expensive up front, the cost compared to how much money you would be spending in bottled water is drastically lower. But bottled water continues to soar in popularity. But what about the environmental impact of the actual bottles? In 1973, polyethylene terephthalate bottles were patented, and just so I never have to try to pronounce those words again, I'll be referring to the bottles as PET bottles, as they are more commonly known. They were the first plastic bottles that could effectively contain carbonation. Before that, glass bottles were used for soft drinks. This made bottling beverages much cheaper, and the bottles could be recycled, although many aren't necessarily recycled into other bottles. A lot of recycled bottles are made into clothing, like t-shirts or insulation for jackets and sleeping bags. Some bottles are even turned into carpeting. Now, even though I was born in the 80s and remember some of the decade, I remember the 90s a lot more, especially the environmentally conscious trend. So I was surprised to see the statistic that only 28% of plastic bottles are recycled. Meanwhile, I will still hold on to an empty plastic bottle as long as possible until I can find a recycling bin, because I hold a lot of guilt whenever I throw something away that could be recycled. Thanks, Captain Planet. You're our hero. One thing I did find, contrary to what many health sites say, is that there's actually not a lot of scientific consensus that 8 glasses of water a day is the perfect amount. It also fails to take into account the water found in other beverages and foods. According to the National Academies of Sciences, most people meet their daily hydration intake by following their natural thirst. Depending on what your level of activity is, you may need to hydrate more often, even if you're sweating. And if you're really worried about drinking enough water, we're about to take a trip to the bathroom. I know, I just talked about toilet paper last week, so you may be wondering if I need some sort of bathroom intervention, but humor me for a minute. When your body releases waste in the form of urine, the waste is yellow. Depending on how yellow your urine is, indicates how much water you're getting. The lighter the shade, the more water is in your system. I won't go so far as to encourage you to check it out for yourself, as I feel that's probably overstepping my bounds. Although I was surprised by the number of people who apparently listened to my show while in the bathroom, which I heard from a few listeners last week. Information for this episode was sourced from Kitchen, NPR, Live Science, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. This week on Trivia Tuesday in the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook, John posted, Fraserburgh Haggis Cupcakes wins the Warren Scotland Craft Butchers Awards 2019, just in time for Robbie Burns Night on the 25th of January. For those like me who didn't know what Burns Night is, it's a celebration of the life of Scottish poet Robert Burns, held on January 25th every year. Haggis is usually included in the celebration because of Burns' poem, Address to Haggis. John also suggested a haggis episode, so maybe, hopefully in the future. Adam posted he learned that the reason you can't buy cashews in a shell is because they are actually a cousin to poison ivy and are toxic. They have to be shelled and cooked to neutralize the toxin. Even raw cashews are actually steamed or boiled to make them safe to eat. If you'd like to talk about trivia you pick up during the week and have it read on the show, join the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook. This episode was brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers, who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind, and who get access to the full scripts of these episodes before they go live. And if you are a Patreon supporter of $1 or more, your monthly bonus episode can be found at patreon.com/thestorybehind. And if you are an existing executive producer, please make sure your updated address is available to get surprise goodies every so often. The full list of executive producers can be found at thestorybehindpodcast.com/executive producers. Thanks for listening. Polyethylene terephthalate. Polyethylene terephthalate. Oh, this is hard. Polyethylene terephthalate. Phthalate. Oh, if I make this a blooper, I want everyone to know that I write out these pronunciations as best I can. And even though I wrote this one about 10 minutes ago, I can't do it. Polyethylene terephthalate now I can't say bottles. Oh, come on. Bottle in front of me, frontal lobotomy. Bottle in front of me, frontal lobotomy. Polyethylene terephthalate bottles were patented. Oh, I did it! Yay.